in a complete shift from last week's, which was mostly 17th and early 18th century. We are going way, way back to the 5th, 6th, 7th century and some of the weird Celtic saints. I was looking through lots of different internet sites for exciting things that happened this week through different periods of history. And one thing I spotted was that there are several interesting Celtic saints who have their saints' days in the early part of June. Now, this is not particularly surprising because there are a huge number of Celtic saints, but some of the really nice ones have their days in early June. And also, if you ever want just a fancy name generator, you can't do much better than just going to a list of Celtic saints. For instance, the 3rd of June, just gone, is the saint's day for Meriadoc and Willow. So, good bit of fancy referencing there. The 6th is for Branwellada, Goodwall and Millon. So again, good on the strange fantasy names. The main ones we're going to look at today are St Petroc, whose date is the 4th, St Kevin, whose date is the 3rd, and St Ronan, whose date is the 1st, but with a few dips into some other ones as well. And the pattern of the stories of these guys' lives that we know of follows roughly the same for all of them. And that's largely because most of what we know about them comes from later, I should say, medieval hagiography, medieval stories, biographies written about them to emphasise what wonderful saints they were. And some of them, of this long, long list of Celtic saints, probably never actually existed in the first place. Somebody just thought it was nice to make up a story about them. Quite often, these books of lives sort of jam every name they can think of into this pattern. So, for instance, there is the place at St Bees is allegedly named for someone called St Bega. The problem with that is, although St Bega has a complete medieval life written about her, there is absolutely no other evidence that a St Bega ever existed, and it has been suggested that the only reason that the chapel was called that is that they had a relic of hers, which was a bracelet, which in a Celtic language of the time is a beag. So she's the saint of the bracelet, and that's all there is to her. And sadly, that's true of quite a lot of the female ones, which is why almost everything we're going to talk about today is the male ones, because they tend to get a little bit more information. Then there is St Briaca, who is the 4th of June, who so little is known about that some scholars think that they are male and some think they're female in the first place. Nobody knows. But equally, a lot of these people clearly did exist because they are doing missionary work, and they do leave behind some evidence. They leave behind stone huts that they've lived in very strange places all around the Celtic fringes. So we can look at that story and think, okay, broadly there's something really going on here. Generally speaking, you can kind of tell which bits are later myth and bits of fun and which bits are actually historically accurate. It's not that hard to figure it out. So most of them come from Wales, some of them Ireland, Cornwall, Brittany. They usually come from royalty or tribal leaders, and they usually have lots and lots of brothers and sisters. It seems like a thing that the royalty of the time did was have enormous families. So, for instance, 2 of the children of King Brychan of Brecknock have a date that is relevant for us. St Petroc being one. This is not terribly surprising given that he had 13 sons and 27 daughters, of whom almost all are supposed to have become hermits or something similar to that. So there's a good chance some of them are going to be on relevant dates. Another Welsh one with a royal connection is St Tudno, whose date is the 5th. And he is supposed to be the son of a king from that lost land out in Cardigan Bay. You know how if you, at low tide, sometimes Cardigan Bay has these fossilised trees. There are all these stories that there used to be a medieval kingdom out there. Not only was there a medieval kingdom out there, it produced saints who went out to other places to do their missionary work. Again, he had several brothers, and all of them went off to become hermits as some kind of penance for the drunken, foolish behaviour of his father, which was what led the place to flood in the first place. So for him, it's a matter of penance for his father. All of these people decide to go away. They generally decide to go to another country. If they're in Wales, they'll go to Cornwall. If they're in Cornwall, they'll go to Brittany, and so on and so forth. And although sometimes there's a missionary aspect to that, a lot of it is just about getting away from people so that they can concentrate on God. They are people who are engaging in what was called white martyrdom. And white martyrdom is leaving your home and everything you know behind for your love of God. And it's often coexists along with blue martyrdom, which is to do with having a life of penance and labour and fasting and all of those types of things. And a lot of people who are one are obviously also the other. This is as set apart from red martyrdom, which is the kind that actually involves blood, which is why it is red. Martyrdom as in dying for your cause. Ireland and the rest of the Celtic kingdoms didn't have a lot of that in relation to their missionaries setting off. They didn't tend to kill missionaries. So there's not a lot of emphasis on that because there just aren't any, there are very few red martyrs in that neck of the woods. So instead they tend to emphasise these white and blue ones, white and green ones, gets called either. So they go off to different places. For some it's voluntary. For some it is sort of enforced. The one woman I will mention here is St. Theniva, and she is found out to have conceived a child outside wedlock, which is clearly disgraceful at the time. She is thrown off a cliff for it, and is mysteriously unharmed when she lands at the bottom of the cliff, so that punishment didn't work. So they just put her on a boat and kick her off out to sea in the expectation that she is just going to die at sea. But of course she doesn't, and God protects her and she finds her way safe to land. This seems a remarkably lenient approach on the part of the God you would expect of that time to an unmarried mother. But of course it's all right, and it counts as a saint story because she is going to give birth to St. Kentigern, who is a much more important figure, and therefore she is allowed to be getting up to this sort of thing. Unconventional travel, and there is always this sort of sea journey involved, is quite normal for these people. St. Piran is a good example of that. He worried his fellow Irish nobles so much with his miracles that they tied him to a millstone and dropped him in the sea, at which point the millstone quite happily floated its way across to floated its way across to Cornwall, where he then set up, and he is a very important Cornish saint, but he got there by millstone. Other examples of these weird travels: St. Brannock, whose date's the 26th of June, travelled in a stone coffin, supposedly, and Ronan travelled just on a rock, as you do. The rock is supposed to have gracefully made its way over the waves and perfumed the air as it travelled, and Ronan is on top praying with a nice sort of holy light around him. Lovely. This does illustrate one small problem, I should say. If you look in lists of saints, there are between 8 and 12 Ronans. The one that happened to is probably the same one who has the Saint's Day on the 1st of June, but we can't be entirely sure because there are between 8 and 12 of them, depending on how you do your counting. Anyway, these people tend to want to go and live away from all of society. They're going to be on their own, or most of them are trying to be on their own. They're going to the margins, they're going to islands and caves and ruins. Bodmin Moor is talked of as being a desert. If you go to Cornwall, a lot of the churches are set quite a long way away from the village, and that's because the church has been built in the place where the saint lived, and then the village attached to it happened, but not right next to the hermit, because that would be rude. Some of the places they go to can be truly quite taxing places. St. Govan, I've been to St. Govan's Head in Pembrokeshire, and his date's the 20th of June. St. Govan's Head is a cliff face, and halfway down it there is a sort of, well, towards the bottom there's a sort of crevice in the rock, and that is supposed to be where St. Govan lived. And the reason he lived there was because when a bunch of pirates were passing by, the rock opened just enough to make him this little space that he could hide in. So that's where he made his shelter and his chapel. But it is not an easy spot to get to, and a lot of these ones aren't. Other ones are much more tame places to go to, and some are frankly cheating. One of the saints... Sorry. There is a chap called Saint Paul Aurelian, who was only 16 when he decided he wanted to, quote, penetrate the desert wilderness and live apart from civil society. So what he did was set up on an empty patch of his father's land, which sounds more like a teenage tantrum to me than actually becoming a hermit. You know, not going to live with you anymore, Dad. I'm going to go and live in a tent at the bottom of the garden. Ha! But we know a bit about the lifestyle of these sorts of individuals, more from the ones who had small communities around them. So quite often you'd take 12 saints, obviously 12 to match the disciples. You'd take 12 people with you to set up. St Columba, for instance, did this when he went to Ireland. He's also got a close by date. 9th of June is his date. And he is a very important saint, founded Iona. Although my favourite thing about Columba is that in his life it says that in 565 he met and banished to the depths a ferocious water beast, and he did this on the river Ness. So he's the earliest sighting of the Loch Ness Monster. There's a poem from just slightly later, 100 or so years later, that describes this sort of monastic lifestyle, and it asks for a small hut in a lonesome spot to make it my abode. But gradually the poet realises that he also needs to have some friends, and that he would choose men to live with me and pray to God as well, quiet men, but men of humble mind. And after a while he realises he needs a lovely church, and it needs a garden with leeks and bees, and he needs to be able to get salmon and trout from the stream. And you can see a little community building up in that description. We can see it in the archaeology as well. If you look at Skellig, which is again a very wild looking island, you can only land there if the weather is good. Very sort of pointed triangular island. And 600 foot up from the cliffs, there are still the remains of 2 oratories and 6 beehive cells, which are these cells made out of a watertight stone walling method that just kind of goes up like that, capstone on the top. And surprisingly, these are not quite as uncivilized as you might think. These surviving beehive cells have protruding stone pegs, which might be for hanging things, or they might be for an internal structure. And they have inbuilt cupboards. And they are built all on the south and southwest of the island, so you'd get maximum sunlight. And there's a terracing system for the gardens. And there is a system of interconnecting cisterns to collect rainwater, because there isn't a spring on the island. I'm not saying it's a nice, easy life, but they're not generally starving. Of course, the irony is, if you are a popular hermit whose holiness becomes famous, people want to come and join you. You can't do this on your own, because as soon as people think you're holy, other people want to come and kneel at your feet and learn how you do it. You can't at that point say, I do it by being on my own. So these sites you tend to build up more and more and more, and the more famous you are and the more followers you get, the more famous you become and the more followers you get. And so it goes, and so it goes. So, for instance, St Goodwall, 6th of June, is a Welshman who goes to a small island in Brittany with 12 people, and within a couple of years he has 88 people living there with him, at which point he leaves them all behind and goes to Devon and walls himself off so he can be entirely on his own, whatever other people think. Which is quite a drastic solution to the problem, but there you go. We can see it in St Kevin. St Kevin starts living alone, specifically to avoid his followers. He says, no, I'm going to go and live on my own. He walks barefoot, he's wearing just animal skins. There's an otter that takes him a salmon every day, supposedly, and a blackbird that builds a nest in his palms as he prays. He stays standing like this for so long that a blackbird can make a nest right there. He is said to have slept in a Bronze Age tomb, which is a sort of man-made space cut out of the rock, which was just large enough for him to sleep in, and you can still go and see St Kevin's tomb. It is about 7 foot by 3 by 3. And he slept just on the bare stone. He had a stone pillow, which is supposedly the stone that you can still see in a museum in Iona, which does have a little dip in it. That's supposed to be where his head rested. Doesn't look that comfortable to me. He is said to have quite often stood naked in the icy loch waters, and also just thrown himself into patches of nettles on a whim, as you do. He doesn't seem to have been very keen on other people, particularly not keen on women. So it is said that at one point a woman was following him around, and whether she's tempting him deliberately or whether he's just afraid that she will, his response at this point is to push her into the nettle patch. Until the 19th century, late 19th century, in Ireland, if you called someone a Kevin, that meant that they were a bit of a cold fish when it came to women. So I don't know if any of you have friends called Kevin out there, but that's what it means. But again, all these people turn up because they want to be with him, because he's so awesome, even though he's also already left once to try to avoid this. And he's got to have somewhere to put them. So he talks to the local king, who is supposedly King O'Toole. And the story goes, O'Toole has a pet goose, which is getting quite old. And Kevin says, I can make your goose young in exchange for you giving me all the land that I can get this goose to fly over. And you can imagine what happens next. The goose is suddenly rejuvenated and does a great long flight, and Kevin gets a lot of land for building his monastery. And on that piece of land, he tries to keep the numbers below 150. So he's not really succeeding in being on his own there. And within a few years, it's pretty much a small university town, at which point he leaves again. Other places get even worse. There are places with hundreds, even thousands of people in them. And he leaves even though it is clearly not luxury conditions. There's a poem written by one of the monks who stayed at this particular monastery, and it says, the wind over the hog's back moans, it takes the trees and lays them low, and shivering monks of frozen stones to the twain hours of nighttime go, which is very atmospheric, I think. So yes, then he went off and became a hermit on his own again to avoid people again. And apart from the bit with the goose, most of that's fairly plausible. Some of the other stories, as I say, these being these sort of Celtic tales that grow, are a little weirder. St. Petroc, the one with the many, many, many brothers and sisters, is said to have at one point come back from one of his travels on a day with very heavy rain. And he told his companions, don't worry, the rain will clear up by morning. The rain actually lasted for days and days and days, and he was so ashamed of his own presumptuousness and his own arrogance in thinking he could tell what the weather was going to do, that he went straight off on another pilgrimage to make up for it. My dad used to say, oh, it's going to be clear in an hour, it's clear over the moors. To be fair, he was usually right, so I don't know if that's the sort of thing that that Petroc was trying at that point. But he decided to go away again to make penance. At this point, he went to India, according to the stories, which is an awful long way to go to avoid the rain, and of course depends if you go in monsoon season. He's supposed to have lived on an island as a hermit in India for 7 years, eating the same fish every day because it grew back overnight, and there was a wolf sitting guarding his stuff, ready for him to pick it back up again 7 years later. So yeah, that's a bit less likely, really. This association with animals, by the way, is very common. A lot of the Celtic saints have animal friends of some sort. St. Cuthbert is the famous one. You know, he has a raven brings him some lard to polish his boots, and some sea otters come up and try and dry him when he's had a dip in the sea. The most fun of these, I've found, is a chap called St. Molling, who is the 17th of June. And St. Molling has a pet fox, according to his life story. And his pet fox, because it's a fox, keeps nicking things. Maybe he did have a pet fox. Foxes can be tamed in that way, and they do keep nicking things. So apparently it took a hen from St. Molling's monastery, and Molling told it off and said, you know, thou shalt not steal. So it went to a nearby nunnery, picked up a live hen from there and brought it back and put it in the monastery to make up for the one that had been eaten. So, you know, it's trying to make a recompense, but it's doing it with another theft. So Molling tells it off for that and tells him to live without ever stealing again. This clearly doesn't work because there's another story later about him stealing a book to have a good gnaw on, and he had to be told, bring that book back at once. And the story says not only did he never touch books again, if anyone would show him a book, he ran off in fright. Make of that what you will. Moving even further into Storyland, we can go to St. Ronan. St. Ronan moved to Brittany and has something of a reputation of being quite capricious, even quite violent. And the main story we have about him is that someone, and depending which version, it could be a peasant or the king or even another saint, is spending so much time visiting him that this person's wife, who does get a name, she's called Kevin, gets jealous and accuses him and says to the king, this Ronan, who my husband's spending all this time with, he's actually a sorcerer. And he can turn himself into animals and go around doing harm in the form of animals, and particularly in the form of a wolf. He has killed several of the sheep around here, and in the form of a wolf he has also killed my only daughter. Curiously, one of the biographies says that this always happens at new moon, which is an interesting twist on the standard werewolf stories, because, you know, this is obviously an early example of someone being accused of being able to turn themselves into a wolf, which is part of that set of stories. To test whether this is true, the king lets 2 fierce dogs on Ronan, on the assumption that if he smelled of wolf, they would go for him. Ronan calms them down instead, so the king's starting to think, you know, maybe this guy is not in fact a sorcerer who can turn himself into a wolf. And Ronan at this point says, I have received a vision from God. I do know what happened to Keban's daughter. What actually happened to her, he says, is that Keban herself locked her in a tiny room, or possibly a box, where she has suffocated to death, and she's trying to pin it on me. And the court go to the place that Ronan has identified and find this to be true. Find that the body of this child is actually in this box. And the court want to execute Keban, and depending on which version of the story you are looking at, either Ronan says, no, it's fine, she'll have learned her lesson, or Ronan says, absolutely fine by me, go ahead, she's a murderer. In either case, he then miraculously raises the small child from the dead. Again, possibly she's just sort of suffocated. And this is perhaps one of the reasons his sort of capriciousness is why people weren't entirely sure what to do with his body when they found him dead. And what they did with it, supposedly, is put it in a cart harnessed by 4 oxen. And then they followed the oxen, who made their way into the middle of the forest, while of course all the trees part before him. And then when the oxen stop, that's where they bury him. This still seems like a slightly more likely way of creating your resting place than doing it for yourself. There are several examples of saints, including St. Willow of the 3rd of June and St. Necton of the 17th, both of whom, when they are beheaded, pick up their own heads and carry it to the place that they want to be buried, and they want a chapel built over them. There is a church out there for one of these guys who has a stained glass window with the saint there with a head under his arm, and also his own head attached to his body, as if he's more grown a new one than carrying his only head. But there you go. So there you have it. Some of the saints, and that's pretty much all stuff just related to the saints of June. And I imagine if you went and looked at the saints of all the other days, you would find lots of other even more bizarre things going on. But I hope you enjoyed that. I will hopefully be back again next week with something completely different, but I have no idea what it is yet. And yeah, take care of yourself, and there'll be big hugs waiting at some point.